We are, we're in a different room. So if someone texts you and says, where are we? Where's the in-person meeting? Tell them it's in room 112, which is in the old section of the DNR building. And if they're wandering about in the halls, tell them to go as far west as they possibly can in the building. And we'll then yell, tech team, and we'll go out and find them. Thank you for being here. This is a great opportunity to meet and to share research and be on the so that get updated about what's been happening in the Great Salt Lake research ecosystem, and a good chance to connect. So thank you for being here in person or online. Can we go around the room in person? And hello. Do a quick introduction, name and affiliation, and then I'll read through the folks online. It's a little bit more clunky to have people online introduce themselves, so I'll just read through people's names. Michael, do you want to start?
Hi, I'm Michael Thorne from University. Presenting first.
Great. I'm Angela Gong with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
I'm Brian Rue, representing the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining.
Wayne, do you have a... Wayne, I see your hand is raised online.
Are they able to hear us?
Wayne, can you hear me?
He's muted.
Hello. All right, we'll keep going around the room, but Wayne, if you want to... Wayne, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I'm the only way I could log in as a viewer, which muted my microphone and camera, and now I can't even. Now maybe I've got it now. Okay, hi, Wayne Wirtsbaugh, Utah State University.
Okay, great. We're going to finish going around the room here.
Sure. Alan Gilbert with Fire, Forestry, and State Lands.
Bill Brown with the Brancham Cooperative.
And Emma Whitaker, Forestry, Fire, and State Land.
Joe Havasu, Compass Minerals.
Jennifer Brooks, Forestry, Fire, and State Land.
Jeff Then Blake Herder, Jacobs.
Here's Mark Wiley.
Hello, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. John Robinson, Forestry, Fire, State Lands.
Strong showing here. And I'll just read through the folks online. We've got Andrew Rupke, Annie Putman, Bill Johnson, Chelsea Cameron, Christine Rumsey, Craig Miller, Elia Jagnecki, Hugh Herlo, Jack Ray, Janice Gardner, John Luft, John Uri, Karin Kettenring, Kim Coburn, Leanna Littler-Wolf. Michael's also here with us in person. Rob Dubuque, Sarah Null, Scott Hynek, and Wei Zhang. And is that the rest? Xiaoban Jiang. And then our AP things. Thank you so much for being here. A few announcements before we dive into our agenda, just updates from a couple of different Great Salt Lake bodies. So Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, their next meeting is March 11th, and that'll be an interesting one. One of the presenters will be Representative Jill Coford, who's the spearheading Great Salt Lake legislation. Will be there to give a summary of the legislation that's happened, that the session will have just wrapped up. So if you're interested in hearing an overview of what's happened with the lake, that could be a great one to come to. That will be up at the Eccles Center at Farmington Bay. The Salinity Advisory Council will be meeting on February 26th, so in 2 weeks, and we're looking at the Salinity Management Plan.
Yes.
Anything else you want to say about that?
No, Christy's been working on a protocol to come up with one salinity value for this environment we can monitor and incorporate it into salinity management plan that's being drafted.
For the tech team research grants, we are the scoring committee is just finishing scoring this week. So I'm sorry we don't have a great update and reveal for this meeting. But we had 28 applications this application round. A lot of them are really impressive. So we'll see how it shakes out, but we're just finishing scoring and we should be sending out announcements about grantees by February 27th. So, stay tuned. Also in the grant world, the trust/FFSL grants, I don't know if anyone here would have applied for those because they're a little bit different flavor. Those are more wetland enhancement stuff, but those closed January 16th. And the technical review committee is also reviewing those right now. That's a $3 million pot of grant money. And then the really big water delivery program, they also closed January 16th, and they're also working through their applications. I think their application pool is much larger. So I don't have a lot of details on what's happening with those yet, but so, you know, lots of exciting grant things coming out soon. Do we have any other announcements that anyone wants to give right now before we kick off? Okay, great. So we've got two interesting presentations today, both of whom were recipients of the Tech Team Great Salt Lake research grants in the past. Our first presenter is Michael Thorne from University of Utah, here to talk about groundwater input into the lake, which is of growing interest. Go ahead.
So I need to share here.
Well, computer screen.
Can't present it, just.
How to do that. Jen, are you able?
It just did it. So.
Oh. Oops.
Oh. All right, so thank you. Well, should I turn my mic on or is this?
It's coming through here, so.
There's fine. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for funding this research and also for allowing me to present here today. The work I'm going to talk about is electrical resistivity work that we did around the Great Salt Lake. And I just want to acknowledge that this is my work, and then primarily this is also the work of Mason Chiquetta, who was a Master of Science student working with me over the last couple of years. So a lot of this work really forms the basis of his thesis. He'll be defending that in about a month. Okay. So in principle, what we do here isn't really that difficult. So the idea is, if we found a couple of electrodes. We put a couple of electrodes into the ground. So this is just a piece of like galvanized. So you put this in the ground and you hook up a battery to this. This induces current to flow in the subsurface. This is not electronic current, but this is ionic current. This is ions in pore space that are primarily flowing, right? And what we can also then do is put another couple of electrodes into the ground. And if we put those electrons into the ground, we can basically, what we do is hook up a voltmeter to that. We hook up the voltmeter to that, we can measure then what's the potential, the voltage between these two electrodes. And then we have a measured current also in the electrodes where we put the battery in. And so this allows us to measure what is the resistance to that current flow in the ground, or what we do this as dimensionless in terms of resistivity. And so what we do, we set this up in a configuration where it's called a dipole configuration. We put current electrodes in the ground and measure these on potential electrodes that are separated further away, measure both the current and the voltage, and then this gives us a measurement of the resistivity in the subsurface. This really just tells us how much that rock material or that soil material is resisting the flow of current, right? What that current depends on, it depends on both the rock or soil type. This is the methodology. It depends on the porosity in the soil. It also depends on the amount of water in the porous spaces there. And it depends on what the salinity of that water is in the porous spaces also. So when we do these measurements, what I'll show you first is we just say, okay, we took these measurements and I'll just plot a circle in the middle, so located in between the current electrodes and potential electrodes. Basically just take a 45-degree angle and plot it. So in practice, we don't take one measurement at each site. In practice, we take something on the order of between 3,000 and 4,000 measurements. And we start off with configuration with the current electrodes shown here, right, where they're very, very close together. And then the potential electrodes sort of moving along. Right? And what you do when you start this out, you're starting this out with the current electrodes and the potential electrodes very close together. This is giving you a measurement of what this resistivity is very close to the surface and in between those electrodes. And then you step this up by separating the width of the electrodes further out. And you just keep doing this and doing this and doing this. And that starts to sample the structure deeper and deeper and deeper in the subsurface, right? So this is just one way of looking at it. This is what we call a pseudo section. This just says, okay, this gives us a sense of the different types of measurements that we've done, where they're located, what our data coverage is, how deep the measurement is sort of looking at. But this is the actual relationship between the resistivity that we measure and what is in the subsurface is more complicated. So if I actually put electrodes in, current electrodes here, my potential electrodes over here, the actual sensitivity of the materials below is, follows a much more complicated problem. Right? So our goal is to basically go from getting an image like this is sort of a crude pseudo section image, to what is the real resistivity structure of the subsurface. And to do that, we do what's essentially called an inversion problem. So we take our raw measurements and say, okay, we're going to solve for the model that best fits those observations. And in this study, we did this in two different ways. First, we just did a 2D inversion. It's a regularized inversion using a package called R2 that comes from Binley and Slater. This has advantages of being able to image any lateral changes that we see in the resistivity structure. It has disadvantage that it's a regularized inversion, which means that this comes out as a somewhat smoother model. Right? So in addition to that, we also developed a 1D Bayesian approach, which is sort of our own code, our own software, our own method that we developed, but only in the 1D sense. The Bayesian inversion is an approach which you basically are randomly selecting from a model space, see which models best represent those data. And you do this tens of thousands of times. And in our case, we've done this hundreds of thousands of models selections, which also allows you to get something of the errors associated with the models that you represent. On the right here, I just show an example of if we have a true model that is a 1D layered case, as shown in this red dashed line, right? We can use the 2D inversion. It's a model that looks like this. There's no lateral variability, right? But if I were to draw a line that goes through the middle of this, you see it's something of a more smooth model. It doesn't really quite fit the resistivity of the true model, but the Bayesian inversion allows us to get much, much closer to the true resistivity values, right? So there's trade-offs here. The 2D inversion allows us to see variations laterally, right, but doesn't necessarily give you the full strength of the resistivities, whereas the 1D method gets you closer to the true resistivities, but doesn't really allow you to see lateral variations, right? So we use a combination of both of these methods. All right, so in this study, we're sort of lucky in the sense that as another project, this is with Evan Adamaka-Mensah and Bill Johnson, they had extracted cores from 5 locations around the Great Salt Lake, where they were also able to measure in these cores what the pore water resistivity is. I guess Scott Enoch is on this call. I think he was very instrumental in getting that work done as well. So in these cores, you can actually go down and actually measure what the resistivity in the pore water actually is as a function of depth. And this gives us something that we can take our measurements and we can compare them to. This gives us a baseline, right? And so each one of these plots shows at a different well location in red. This is what the pore water resistivity is as a function of depth. We base this on a classification scheme of Heath, 1983, I believe, where you look at the resistivity, you can characterize this as either being brine water, very saline, moderately saline, slightly saline, all the way up to fresh water. But then what we can do is we can now compare our own resistivity measurements, and this is in blue is resistivity measurements that we made at each of these sites. So we tried to co-locate some of our own resistivity measurements as near to some of these cores were taken as we could. They're not all right on top of each other. A lot of these wells were driven into places where we couldn't exactly access equally, but we got pretty close, right? And so the point that I want to make is when you look at the cores and the pore water resistivity, what we see in our resistivity images actually tracks these resistivities very well, right? And so ultimately what we would like to know is what is the pore water resistivity from our measurements, right? Except, it's more than just the pore water resistivity that we're measuring what I would say is the bulk rock resistivity, right? And the relationship between the bulk rock resistivity and the pore water resistivity, it's a very simple linear relationship if you're in sandy soils. But we look at the sites that we have out here, they're all sort of a mixture between sands and clays. And we start to get clays in the mixture, then the relationship becomes more complicated. It becomes a little bit of a nonlinear relationship, right? Nonetheless, basically what we see is our bulk rock resistivity basically matches to the most part what the pore water resistivity is. It's just offset should be a little bit larger. So what we'd like to use then is our measurements essentially as a proxy for the salinity at each of our sites, right? And I think we're justified in doing this in the sense that what our resistivity measurements depend on are the lithology at each site, which is mostly just sands and clays. It doesn't vary too much from site to site, just different mixtures of sands and clays. It also depends on the water saturation. Now at all of these sites, we went out and we actually dug to the water table. It's only about 18 inches deep at every site we went to, right? And so it's pretty much the same saturation level everywhere. There might be some variation in porosity from one site to the next, but I think that's more of a secondary factor here. I think what that leaves us with is the majority of the changes that we see in terms of our measured resistivity is really related to the salinity of the pore water. Okay. So we can take all of our measurements, and we can take all of the measurements that were done in the core. And so this is the pore water resistivity on this axis, and then this is our bulk rock resistivity on this axis. And it's hard to draw it exact hard lines here. But basically what we say, we compare these two. There is some variation from site to site, but we can make a classification scheme for our measurements in relationship to the measurements from the cores. And what I'm going to show you from here on out is the images that we've made, and it's going to be on this color scale that's based on relationship between the core and our measurements. And so everything that I'll show you from here on, if it has a really, really low resistivity, this is consistent with the brine water resistivity. And so this is basically anything less than about half an ohm meter. And then if you're up above 7 ohm meters, everything here was clearly fresh water in cores, and anything in between. So going from sort of orange up through yellow to green, this is saline water going from very saline to slightly saline. And so we put the freshwater saltwater interface here at about 7 ohm meters, right? But every image I show you from here on out will be on this color scheme. Okay. So overall, we collected data at greater than 30 different locations. As I said before, we use this dipole configuration for our measurements, and the separation between our electrodes we used is we either did this in one spot where it was just a 1 meter separation. Most places we used a 2.5 meter separation, and in some places we did 5 meter separation. The difference in these different separations is ultimately how long our total line is. We have a total of 72 electrodes, right? So if we did 1 meter separation, then our total line length is just 72 meters, right? 2.5 meter separation, this gives 180 meter line. And this really ultimately affects what our depth of investigation can be. Right? So how deep we're seeing beneath the subsurface is it's somewhere on the order of about 1/4 of what the total line length is. So depending on the different electrode separations that we use, we were able to see at different depths. So roughly 15 meters down to about 60 meters depth, depending on what our separation is. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk you through what our major results are, sort of a summary of our major results. I'm going to start down here at Burmester. I'm going to make my way up through Saltaire and Lees Creek area, and we didn't have much access into this area. Then I'll jump up here to sort of the Farmington Bay, the eastern shore of Farmington Bay, and then I'll jump up to, this is Howard Slough Wilderness area. We also did some measurements all the way up to Ogden Bay, and I'll jump back down to the Antelope Island Causeway into the interior of Farmington Bay, and then show you some of the measurements we did along Antelope Island. Okay, so I'll start off, I'll remind you where everything is, because I know most people don't know where's Burmester Road. Like all of our sites we have these names, right? So start off at each one, and I'll just give sort of a key as to where each one of these measurements was taken. So we'll start off here. This is the site at Burmester Road. And we were able to run three long lines here, sort of overlapping. This was a total line length of about 1/2 kilometer. And what we saw here is really can be characterized by just a simple, we saw a sort of sandy surface layer at the top. And this was overlying a very, roughly 7 meter thick layer of really, really low resistivities, which is consistent with brine pore water. So we see this is one of the sites. This is the location where wells or one of the cores was taken. And so we can see where our line was run relatively close to here. And we can see that the pore water resistivity measured here. We also see this very low resistivity channel on the pore water resistivity. We picked that up also in our inversions. That tracked pretty well. And then in the pore water resistivity, they see an increasing resistivity until you get into this zone here, which is sort of slightly saline, getting very close to fresh water. So this is what we see also. Then at a depth of about 8 meters deep, we see a sharp increase, a sharp jump, higher resistivities. Our model gives sort of resistivity up to about 9 ohm meters. This is really very much on the interface, right on the boundary between this is fresh water and this is slightly saline water. And then looking across this whole line, there's very little lateral variation. Right? This is pretty much consistent in this location. So jumping over to salt air. So just sort of moving a little bit further east along the coast to get to the salt air region. We took a lot of measurements in this area. And here things look a little bit different because all of a sudden here you have a layer, it's about 3 to 4 meters thick. It's just below the subsurface. And now it's not just a pore water sort of thing, but we have a layer of mirabolite here on the subsurface. So mirabolite is crystallizations of it that we've seen at the surface. This is a kind of salt, also called glauberous salt. So when we look at our resistivity results here, we see that first we have a jump up to this mirabolite layer. That's shown here, goes up to about 2.5–3 meters. But we can see it in the 2D inversions here. And we can see that here it kind of comes and then it goes out. Here it comes and it goes out. I'll get back to this more later. But then, like we saw at Burmester, then we have a jump back down to really, really low resistivities. So then we have a layer here that's, sort of 15 to 20 meters thick of really low resistivity brine pore water. And then we absolutely have to have a jump, an increase in resistivity with depth around 20 meters, but it's also just a jump up to a very low resistivities. This is also still consistent with the very saline brine pore water. At these sites, we also did transient EM work with Elliot Jagnicki and Christian Hardwick at UGS, and so we see the inversions using the transient EM method. I mean, this is very identical to what we got with our resistivity technique. Also, that helps to corroborate our findings. If you go a little bit further to the east, there's a spot that Elliot Jagnicki showed us where there's an active mirabolite spring. So these have started occurring over the last several years. And so we were able to run a ERT line very much next to where this active spring mound occurs. You can see there is a well here. This is Elliot's well. It's like right in the most active part of the spring mound. And if you look at our results here, we can see clearly where this well is and where the upwelling is coming out. You can see that there's a clear conduit in the mirabolite layer. And so what we see is we have this brine pore water under here. Some previous efforts by Anderson in 2014 did pressure measurements, showed that this pore water in here looks like it's under pressure. So what it looks like we see here is that we have brine pore water under pressure, and it can emerge up onto the surface, and this looks like this is occurring in places where there are already sort of channels or conduits or breaks within the mirabolite layer. And as we image across here, we see there's a number of different spots, say along this larger line, where there are potential breaks, potential conduits. So this gives some explanation as to why the mirabolite spring mounds are actually occurring where they are. Okay. Moving along a little bit further east to the Lease Creek Nature Area. What we see here, I'm going to say we did 3 lines here. I call them LC1, 2, and 3. So sort of moving up the coast here. What we see first here at LC01, and this is the image here. We see now the mirabolite layer is gone. So the mirabolite layer existed basically between Burmester and here LC01, then it disappeared again. And then what we see here is just a brine, very saline pore water right here on the boundary. But as we start to move further up to the north and the west, what we start to see is that the resistivity starts to increase at depth, such that at the point that we're here at LC02, this appears to be getting closer to very slightly saline water. And then by the time we get to LC03 here, we're starting to see what's looking like fresh water. And this fresh water is occurring at a depth of starting of only 3 meters beneath the surface here. We noted here that if we look, this is a map of Paleo Jordan River by Keene, and he just shows that here is the present day Jordan River, but the Paleo Jordan River actually flowed and went out this way. So this would give greater permeability paths, maybe from water coming in off the Wasatch going in this direction. And this might help to explain why we're seeing more fresh water as the time we get to LCO3 here. And this is presumably then water coming off the Wasatch, and it may have a preferred flow path this direction. Continuing on further up to Farmington Bay, we had 3 different measurements along the eastern coast of Farmington Bay. And this is interesting here too, because now if you go from south going up to the north, you see here in the south, well, you still have some slightly saline water at depth here. But as we go further and further to the north, we start to see a signal of really, really strong fresh pore water. I mean, our resistivities jump. They start to jump at about depth of only about 5 meters, and then they start to jump into the 10s, and in some cases all the way up to getting close to 100 millimeters, which is really, really strong signal of fresh pore water. So this is where we really, really start to see the strongest evidence for really fresh water coming into the system, and at depths that are 5 meters or less. In fact, as all the observations I'll show you, fresh pore water basically comes in at a depth of less than 10 meters. Okay, if you go further north to Howard Slough Wilderness Management Area, this is a spot where you start to see, at least in the Google images, what we saw is all these round spots. These round spots actually consist of circular features of Phragmites that are coming in at the surface. We were able to run a line that goes pretty much right along the side of one of these, and this line actually went through a portion of this round spot our area. And now what we see here is we can see there's fresh pore water very, very near the surface all along this area. We see some of the most fresh water coming up very close to where these round spots are. You can see here, I mean, normally we have a very salty layer here, and this is where our line went through this round spot to a certain extent. You can see, oh, there's a decrease in the resistivity here. And so it looks like fresh pore water is coming up at these spots where we have the round spots. Would explain the presence of the Phragmites there if we have fresher water. And it's also suggestive, if you look here, it's like, oh, there's a big, thick layer of fresh water, but it seems like there's less fresh water here beneath this, that perhaps these round spots are sucking some of the fresh water out of the system and it was being lost to evapotranspiration, right? But normally, if the lake was at a higher level, what we would see is these Phragmites would not be here. This would probably be places where fresh groundwater was actually discharging into the lake, which it's no longer doing right now because the Phragmites are sucking it up. Okay, I'm going to move on now to Antelope Causeway. I'm going to talk about Ogden Bay. Ogden Bay, we also saw evidence for fresh water very shallowly at about 5 meters depth, but very, very little lateral variations. Now we moved on to the causeway, and I'm going to go from the east over to the west, looking that direction. And this is the furthest image to the east. Here we see fresh, really fresh pore water, resistivities, close to 100 ohmmeters at a depth of 4 meters. And then as you go across the causeway closer to the Antelope Island, we see sort of a decrease in fresh pore water, and there's still fresh pore water is getting more and more saline to the point where it's sort of slightly saline by the time we get to Antelope Island. I want to show you this a little bit more closely. We spent a lot of time looking at this because this is one of the coolest things we saw in this whole study. We spent a lot of time worrying about this. This is the inversion that we saw. And what it looks like here is we have a very saline layer at the surface with what looks like fingering coming down into the subsurface. We were worried that this is real true, so we've done a number of forward models. This is a forward model that we did, inverted the forward model. So yeah, we can indeed recover this kind of structure. We went back out and measured this a few different times. Exact same electrode positions. We actually took 5 different measurements at this exact location just to confirm that this is indeed what we were seeing. We did a number of sensitivity tests with bootstrap resampling where we actually removed half of our data, then redid the inversion. We did this multiple times and we still see this. I think this is interesting because this is something that's sort of predicted in almost every study that I've ever seen, looking at salt water sitting on top of fresh water. So the salt water is denser than the fresh water, and so it should produce convective instability. So this is from, just sort of an animation from a numerical study. But if you look at numerical studies and also tank experiments, this is typically what you see is that that salt will start to sink, right? And I believe that this is actually what we're imaging here. And so I think that's pretty cool. To my knowledge, this has only actually been observed in the natural environment in one other place. This was on the coast of the United Arab Emirates. And to our knowledge, if this, what we're imaging here is truly fingering, this is, to my knowledge, only the second time this has ever been imaged anywhere in the world. So then I'm going to move from there and we go across into the center of Farmington Bay. And this is what Bill Johnson and Evan have named round spot number 9. There's a couple of these very large round spots in the middle of Farmington Bay. If you look at this, you might as well be on the surface of the moon, except for the case there's this big mound of Phragmites across here. This is actually 70 meters across here. And so we were able to run a resistivity line that went right through the middle of this thing, right? And the results are just absolutely, the image is just absolutely spectacular. So this is our line. We ran a line, really long line with 5-meter spacing, and then another smaller line with 2.5-meter spacing in between. And then this is the image that we get, right? What we have here, and this is another thing where we've done this, confirming this with forward modeling and a whole other variety of tests. But what we have here is what we're imaging is about it's about a conduit of about 100 meters in diameter of fresh pore water. It's just apparently just rising straight to the surface. This almost looks like, I do most of my work in global seismology in a mantle. This looks like a whole mantle plume, right? But this is, it looks like a freshwater plume that's coming up to the surface. It looks like it's displacing, any of the salty surface layer that was there. It looks like it's displacing that. That's starting to drip down, back down into this, right? Bill and Evan had wells in these locations here, and so what they saw also is corroborated our imagery here in terms of sort of the freshness, salinity, water. Right. So that's pretty cool. Like, why on earth these are here? Well, to this, I would basically say I looked at, there was an old model of bedrock. This comes from McNeil and Smith. This used a combination of gravity data, and then back in 1990, when this was still filled with, Farmington Bay was still filled with water, they actually ran a seismic reflection study on boats, right? So they ran boats across and shot like an air gun, and were able to do seismic reflection. And so they got about, they had like 9 seismic reflection lines. So they made a really nice bedrock model across the area. And so what you see when you look at their bedrock model is that along this ridge, there's very high in the topography. So if I were to look at the cross section that goes through here, where we see round spots 9 and 10, this matches up very well with where this high is. So what we saw previously is that we know that this water is coming up at least 70 meters deep, which is how far we can image, right? But this looks like this is coming up from depth. So probably there's some deep flow sort of emerging at the surface at these spots, which is probably controlled by the basement of this location. Okay, so I'm just going to show you one more location, and then this is on the edge of Antelope Island. First on the north side of the island, and then another section or another line here on the south side of the island. Look at these results. We're at the very northernmost edge of the island, and we don't see much. We saw at the end of the causeway, very brine pore water at the surface, but getting, it's moderately saline, at depth. If you're at the very north end of the island, there's not much topography, so we don't think there's too much water coming off the island. If you go to the south end of the island, though, it looks much more interesting. It looks like to us, so this here is the west direction, so Antelope Island is here. It looks to us like we have fresh water coming into the system at depth of the side here. There's another spot where now we also start to see what looks like fingering that appears here. We actually seen this in 3 or 4 of our spots, not just the causeway. Right? So the causeway was maybe the best example, so I try to highlight that. But I also like to highlight that we see this apparent fingering at other locations as well. Okay, so I just want to summarize. This is sort of a very busy plot of a 1D inversion basically everywhere along the eastern shore of Farmington Bay. The main thing I want to make is to show you that if you look at almost all of these sites, we see a large jump in resistivity at a depth of sort of 5 meters or less. And in a few places, you have to maybe go down to 10 meters or 15 meters before you get this. But basically, everywhere we see a large jump to higher resistivities that's indicative of fresh water along the eastern shore of Great Salt Lake. And most of that occurs at a depth of 5 meters or less. And thank you. I want to also thank everybody who has in some way contributed, helped out with this project. Mason Giacchetta, of course, this was his MS thesis. Also Surya Pishai, who helped a lot with the Bayesian inversion. And then also Bill, Evan, for their help with the geochemistry and the well data, and then everybody else who's also contributed to field work. So thank you.
Questions? Mike. Yeah, go ahead, Wayne. Wayne, you might be frozen. Did you have a question? Can we hear you?
Yeah, so it shows my camera on and my mic on, but I'm not moving in the video. But could you go back to the slide that shows the bedrock?
Yes.
So it looks like a lot of those you have the bedrock at, well, I guess I can't tell what the scale is for sure. It's such a huge scale, but it seems like, are you hitting bedrock and getting that as part of your interpretation, your resistivity, or are you sure you have sands and clays down to the 30, 60 meters, whatever you're measuring in your resistivity?
No, that's a good question. In all of these locations, so the depth to bedrock is really deep, several kilometers, right? Beneath all of our sites. I was worried about it most at salt air because you're so close to the ochres there. But the models that they have there, and this is based primarily on gravity and magnetic data, would even show that at that location, bedrock is 3.5 kilometers deep. If you look in some of these other studies, or if I look at my original map, there is actually a number of wells, a number of old wells that were also drilled in certain locations. I don't have them on this map, I'm sorry, but there's a bunch of wells that have been drilled around these locations. These are old oil test wells, and there they also sort of confirmed that we get bedrock in a lot of these cases to 1.5 kilometers or even deeper. And if you're here at Burmester, it's 3.5 kilometers deep there also. So we're pretty far away from bedrock locations.
Okay, on the color scale on the graph you were showing, or did show the bedrock, the color scale made it look like it was closer to 0 kilometers deep.
Okay, sorry about that.
So, like at the western edge of that dotted line there.
That's exactly what you're talking about, yeah.
It looks like the depth of the bedrock is very shallow. Am I misinterpreting something?
It comes up to the surface here for sure. Right at the edge of Antelope Island, it comes up to the surface there. Right, so it's 0 there.
Okay.
So our measurements are further out on the playa. It's still deeper than 30 meters thin.
What's the depth under those spots?
I don't know exactly the depth right of the spots.
I guess if it's multiple kilometers, it wouldn't have with that.
Here it would
too
be
deep to have it in.
Here it wouldn't be multiple kilometers. Here it's I mean, 1 kilometer depth is here, right? So it's less than a kilometer, right? At the deepest part here, it's probably about 3 kilometers across this cross section. The deepest part of all is down over here, right? I don't know what the depth is here, but it's
Okay, thanks.
thank you.
Sarah, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. That was an interesting talk. I was wondering if you could discuss your results with, given the previous research that kind of upped the contribution of groundwater to Great Salt Lake. Like, how do your results support that, or are your results meant to simply show where there maybe more groundwater or less groundwater? Or can you maybe situate your results a little bit?
No, I would like to, I would like to be able to answer that question better. At this stage, I can't. At this stage, we're basically just at the position of this is where we're seeing groundwater, right? And this is where our fresh groundwater, this is where we're not. And then we're also seeing evidence that it would be or should be upwelling at these particular round spots that we're seeing. But I can't myself at this stage give more information as to this is how much groundwater input should be going into the lake.
Okay, fair enough.
But that would be ideal to get to that point.
Christine, go ahead. Christine, we can't quite hear you. Are you far away from a mic?
Well, Christine's working on that. So would you just summarize what you think is the driver and the upwelling at the spots? Do you have a thought on that?
Well, and certainly we have flow coming in from the Wasatch. So this water's coming in, presumably coming in at depth at some point. I guess is to a certain point it's getting heated up there. I don't know, but that would be my guess.
So it's really interesting for me with our evaporation ponds. We do have the northernmost pond region on the east side, adjacent to a Willard Spur. If you look at aerial photographs, it's just pockmarked, and it's these freshwater upwells that come through the accumulated salt in those ponds. Now, depth of bedrock, I imagine it's pretty deep, like greater than at least 300 meters deep. But your point on the warmer water, we do have a well that goes 900 feet deep, and it's constantly at 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So I think that theory is
We've got 2 comments. So Christine is able to type hers. Are there other areas around the lake you suspect groundwater is coming in, and where would this technique be helpful?
ponds.
Oh yeah, so yes, absolutely there is. And I mean we've only looked at the South Shore and the Eastern Shore here. It would be really fascinating to look at the other side of Antelope Island, and then there's the whole region around the north and northwest side of the lake. And there's probably groundwater coming locations there. Elliot Jagnecki here would be the better person to answer the questions related to those areas.
Clyman Bay as well. We did a groundwater investigation in Clyman Bay, and there's ample groundwater flowing into the system.
All right. Thank you.
And then Elliot ducked off, but he
Elliot
made
ducked
the
off,
comment
okay.
that
Oh, yeah.
could distributary paleo channels or deltas play a role in transpacific pathways. You talked about paleo Jordan, which
Paleo Jordan, and yeah, and any others, I'm sure would also play an effect.
Wondered, the brine layer that you observed, do you think there's any there a spatial pattern to that? Is there a correlation to the lake level? Where you saw the low resistivity at the surface?
We saw this mostly on the southern shore. So we saw it at Burmester. There was about 7 meters thick. As you move towards salt air, it got really thick, right? So 15 to 20-ish meters thick there. I think the reason being is that at salt air, you're right at the northern tip of the Ochres. I think most of the water is coming off either side of the Ochres. So you have recharge coming in from the Ochres, either at Burmester, or you have some coming out, maybe towards Leeds Creek, and we also have water from Wasatch coming towards Leeds Creek. And I think less at salt air. So I would suspect that that's why you see such a big rise. Yes.
And then the fingers, to make sure I understand, that's where salty groundwater is going down into fresh groundwater?
Yeah, so it's just density driven flow.
Okay.
Right? The salty water is more dense than the fresh water.
Right.
And so it's expected it should just.
And it's just coming, it's not from surface, it's moved from groundwater.
Well, the fresh groundwater is coming in, right, from the Wasatch.
Okay.
But we have the salt layer, the salty layer.
So it's as the freshwater mixes with the salty.
Yeah, as it's coming in, right, then the salt layer, they're sitting on top of a less dense fresh groundwater.
Okay.
And so it just wants to.
Okay.
See.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to make sure that Karin has enough time, but if you've got more questions for Mike, really fascinating. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Karin Kettenring is online, and she's going to be talking with us today about her ongoing work. This latest portion is about sea-based restoration, reestablishing Great Salt Lake wetland communities, especially when we don't know how much water there's going to be, and that's very pertinent right now. So Karin, go ahead and kick us off.
Great. Thanks. How is my microphone? Am I clear?
Yeah, you sound great and it looks good.
And you can see the full screen.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Well, that was a super interesting talk. And I would, being interested in Phragmites, Michael, I'd love to talk to you more about that at some point too, just those different images you showed and kind of the ecosystem engineering capacity of Phragmites is very interesting to me. Anyway, so I'm pleased to talk to you today about restoration of Great Salt Lake wetland plant communities and this context that we are all trying to grapple with, this uncertain water future. So as I was putting this talk together last week, my slides are not advancing. Let me try a couple options here. I realized that rather than doing a deep dive into our work from the last year or so, that this was really a great opportunity for me to actually tell you all kind of our 30,000 foot vision of what we've learned from lots of years of experiments and great funding from Forestry, Fire, State Lands, among other organizations. So a little bit of perspective here. So we've been working on revegetation for a long time now, and I want to share with you what have we learned. Unfortunately, being an academic, I thought I was going to have 10 lessons. I couldn't restrict myself to 10. And this is reflecting maybe 15 to 17 years worth of work. And it's also reflecting lots of graduate student projects. So all these students here and my lab manager, Sam, as well, you're going to be hearing about various snippets and how all these pieces fit together to help us understand revegetation better. So I'm going to start with, in each of these slides, I have a lesson learned, and then I'll give you a little bit of the research background behind it. And so the first thing I just want to start with is that we know, or we have seen, that seeding and planting in wetlands is actually underappreciated and underutilized globally and regionally, but the tides are turning. And so this is not just a problem to Great Salt Lake wetlands. It's, for whatever reason, there's been this assumption that in wetland restoration, that if you fix, you get the invasive species removed or you restore the hydrology, the plants magically come back. But that has not really been the case. So when I'm talking about revegetation, seeding, and planting, seeding is pretty straightforward. Sometimes people are hand seeding, but more often than not, they're using heavy machinery to get across wetlands and use broadcast seeders. In planting, the two most common strategies are to plant with plugs, those seedlings you can see in the left there, as well as sod mats, those coconut fiber mats with the plants grown up in them. So when early on in my time at USU, I wanted to get a sense of actually people's Phragmites management strategies. So I did a survey pretty early on, but I also had one question at the end, and I asked, are you revegetating? And this was a survey to managers on Great Salt Lake, Utah Lake, and Bear Lake. And interestingly, at the time in 2012, most people did not think it was necessary, about 86%. And generally, the reason people were not, another reason people were not revegetating was because it was too costly. So these are themes that will come back in the talk today. But what we have found since then through our research and other people's research as well is that seeding and planting are essential for recovering lost diversity, increasing invasion resistance, and establishing lost habitat. And some of this comes from the work from quite a while ago now from both Christine Rohal and Chad Cranny. And they evaluated a variety of Phragmites management strategies. And, you know, at this point, I think we're really quite good, the royal we, of managing Phragmites in many places. But what ends up coming back, can you see my cursor there actually? Hopefully, yes, I can see a head nod. You can see this is an example. Often we're left with areas lacking native vegetation, maybe a few cattails, as you can see these photos, or maybe a couple forbs coming in. And because management is so effective, we often are left with this bare ground situation, which is prime for Phragmites reinvasion. So we need to be seeding and planting to reestablish that native vegetation. And that native, you know, vegetation is important not just for, well, diversity is important in and of itself, of course, but we also are all interested in reestablishing lost habitat. So this is the essential first step. We also know that managers face challenges to implementing revegetation. And some of what we know comes from more recent surveys we have done. This is a survey we did of actually wetland managers on state and federal lands throughout the entire Intermountain West, so not just northern Utah. But we wanted to know what challenges are people facing, particularly with respect to environmental factors, which is the upper graph here, as well as capacity-related challenges. Because part of our goal is to really help facilitate revegetation much more broadly. So you can see right away that in terms of environmental factors that are challenging folks' land management, restoration, and revegetation work, a lot of it is about water, drought and climate change, and also invasive species, and the timing and delivery of water. And in terms of capacity-related challenges, many managers obviously face budget limitations. This is nothing new. Lacking personnel specific to revegetation needs and the logistics required to do revegetation. So building on those concepts of the trade-offs here, we know that the choice of whether to seed or plant is driven by ecological, cost, and logistical factors. And each decision is, you know, each of these approaches has trade-offs. So this is coming from work in part from Lauren Taylor's thesis. She just graduated this past year, and she did in-depth interviews, perhaps with some of you in the room or on the call, in managers in northern Utah working on wetland management. And she asked questions, or as part of her work, she monitored areas where there had been extensive seeding, plug planting, and sod mat planting to look at both plant establishment and native cover. But in addition, from those surveys, she inquired about the installation requirements, plant material costs, and equipment costs of these different revegetation strategies. So without going into too great a detail here, you can see this is basically summarizing some of her results. The various techniques listed here in this first column have a variety of aspects about them that are either least favorable in red here or pretty favorable, such as seeding having relatively low plant material cost relative to plugs, and sod mats having pretty high plant material costs. So this framework can be very helpful for people that are just embarking on their revegetation journeys and are trying to make decisions, because it's not just, you know, as a plant ecologist, I would like to say that all decisions are made by, hey, what plants are going to do most, or what approaches are going to do most well, but that's not the reality in which most people are working. So, okay, so now we're going to get into some of our seed and plant experiments, and I'll get a little bit into the nitty-gritty details here. One of the key things that we discovered early on is that if the Phragmites seed bank, seeds stored in the soil, are not, if that's not sufficiently reduced, it doesn't matter how many seeds you might be introducing into a restoration site. And so this is some work that's actually was from Emily Tarsa's PhD research a few years ago. And in these kiddie pool mesocosms here, she manipulated both Phragmites seed density, 10, 500, or 5,000 seeds per meter squared. The norm for our region is about, you know, around about here if there's been no management in terms of Phragmites seed density in the soil. And then she also introduced native seeds from about 1938 seeds per meter squared up to about 10,000, which is a very high rate. You can see here the green is the native plant biomass response, and then the red is the Phragmites biomass response. So we found a very striking, strong relationship related to how many Phragmites seeds were introduced. And so this essentially tells us that unless Phragmites seeds are greatly reduced through management, you're just going to have a lot of Phragmites in your areas. And we saw a pretty orthogonal, almost orthogonal relationship with the native response. As Phragmites increased, native plants decreased proportionally. Interestingly, as the native seed density increased, we saw a much more modest increase with native biomass and a much more modest reduction in Phragmites biomass. I'll say two things here. One, this was a mesocosm experiment, so it doesn't necessarily reflect the full realities of harsher field conditions, and that'll be more clear in a minute here. But it does tell us if there's a fair amount of Phragmites present in a site, it does, you know, your increasing seeding rates is not going to happen, or not going to really have a positive effect. Okay, another key thing that has been interesting is that this option of adding microtopography through disking helps keep seeds in place and improve seedling establishment, particularly through bed hedging for soil moisture. You're going to hear me talk a lot about soil moisture limitations and lack of water and how we can hedge our bets. What can we do to try to get seeds and plants in the right place to align with those appropriate conditions? So some of this initial work came from Karina Hebert's master's research. She's now at Ducks Unlimited, so some of you may work with her. And so in the ecological literature, there are different ways that people are evaluating microtopography and trying to replicate that in restoration conditions. But as you can imagine in the field, as water levels are fluctuating on smaller scales, that when you have this variation in microtopography, seeds that land here versus in here are going to have different environmental conditions, and it might be just the right conditions for success. So it's a way to potentially improve seedling establishment. And so she has found that that did have an important impact. And in fact, now Forestry Fire State Lands and some of their collaborators are disking quite a bit more before they revegetate. This has kind of become standard practice, actually. And here's just an example actually from Utah Lake from just last year of creating that microtopography to help keep seeds in place. We have also found that seeding density matters, and the densities that have been the seeding densities that have been used historically are almost always too low. But to have sufficient densities, it's going to be extremely costly to address. So this is both an ecological factor, but a cost factor as well. And this is because in the field, seeds and seedlings are highly vulnerable. This is just basic biological reality. We know not just in wetlands, but in other ecosystems as well, that seedlings, we potentially could have mortality rates of 95 to 99%. So what can you do about that? Generally, what we have been finding and what we have then been encouraging is that seeding at higher than what had been the standard rate the last 10 years or so is leads to much better outcomes. And so in this, oh dear, can you see that screen sharing thing? I think I just messed this up. Oh wait, I'm gonna hide that. Maybe you don't see that at all. Okay. Here's some work from Ray Robinson's master's research. And through her experiments, she did a number of experiments at both Farmington Bay and Howard Slough. And in one of her experiments, she looked at sowing density. This is pretty straightforward plot here, but here's kind of the standard rate, and here's 3 times that rate. And you can see again in blue, the total native, and red, the total invasive response. And we saw a much stronger improvement in, this is proportion cover, in native cover with that much higher seeding rate. So as a result, you know, Forestry Fire State Lands has been targeting higher seeding rates that are more in line with that 3 to 5 times rate. The exact seeding rate is hard to translate because, as you can imagine, every species has seeds that weigh different amounts. So that's a little bit challenging to have just one recommendation, but generally 50 pounds per acre is what they're using. Getting the optimal seed mix composition is really complicated, and that's because some species will dominate sometimes, but not always. And so we've had a number of experiments both in the greenhouse and the field looking at, you know, really beautiful seed mixes, trying to figure out what we should be recommending. And so this is some other work by Ray Robinson. And one of the interesting things that we found was that under ideal conditions, whether that's in the field where soil moisture levels are really just perfect, or in the greenhouse, such as these conditions here, we found that these forb species that have these broad leaf covers, really important for Phragmites invasion resistance, they dominate under these ideal conditions. But that hasn't been the case necessarily in the field, so it's a little less clear cut. So in one example here from this greenhouse experiment, she manipulated seed mix composition. Here, mix was all graminoids, so all grass-like plants, bulrushes, rushes, spike rushes, versus 100% forbs, or a 75-25 or 50-50 mix. So in terms of the total native response, as soon as we had any forbs in the seed mix, which are these last 3 data points, we had really high forb cover, and we had a related reduction in Phragmites. But then when we took this to the field, here are some results from Farmington Bay from some of our field work. We saw actually the exact opposite response, which was pretty surprising. The most successful seed mix in the field were these graminoid species, and they, under these conditions at Farmington Bay, did particularly well, had high cover, and actually the forbs did not perform as well in the field. So this has been something that we, you know, have been trying to sort through, and it really does have to do with how good or not good the field conditions are for seeds and seedlings. And these forbs seem to be pickier, which is challenging for you know, the restoration goals of trying to prevent Phragmites from coming in. So working with diverse species requires a lot of new specialized knowledge. This is something that we've had to work with. And so, you know, for each of the species that we are trying to help facilitate their use in restoration, we have to know when can we collect the seeds, where, and how can we collect the seeds? How can we clean the seeds? How do we test to see if they're viable? How do we break dormancy? How do we get these seeds to germinate? And each of those aspects takes a lot to sort out because we're working with many dozens of species. So I'll just say through years and years and years of work, we have been developing protocols to work with these species, both for our research experiments, but also to facilitate restoration. And we've been putting a fair amount of effort into these extension guides here to summarize for those others that want to embark on, land managers, native plant vendors that want to embark on working with these species. We also know obtaining a diversity of seeds requires longer timelines because they're not necessarily commercially available, and you might actually have to self-collect them. And so from one of our, we did a different survey throughout the Intermountain West. I mentioned earlier that a survey of wetland managers of their revegetation practices. At the same time, we did a survey of native plant vendors because we wanted to know what is out there for people to be able to buy. And so through these efforts, we found that on average, vendors had about 4 or fewer aquatic species, 15 or fewer emergent species, 15 or fewer playa species readily available for purchase. And that might seem like a fine number, but I do find it pretty concerning when you consider what the flora is in our region. We have about 1,600 wetland species in the arid West in the same region. So a very small fraction is readily available for people to be able to purchase and acquire for restoration. We also have learned and experienced over and over and over again that restoration conditions are often unpredictable. And so to hedge your bets, this is again another theme here, seed mixes should contain a range of species with varied hydrologic preferences. So in 2 examples with Alana Feldman's work and Maddie Hood's work, when they were doing their experiments in 2022 and 2023, in 1 year there was unbelievable amounts of water for the wetlands, in fact, too much water. And then the next year, extremely dry conditions. And because seeds and seedlings are so vulnerable to these conditions, it's really hard to get anything to establish. And so, as a general strategy, we're just encouraging people to use a wide range of species. There has been, historically, I think more of a focus on bulrushes because their seeds are so important for migratory birds. But as we are really trying to get a variety of species established, we need to take a much broader approach. Beyond just using more species, there are many bet hedging strategies, and what you might choose depends on your restoration goals and site conditions. And so I'm going to pull from Haley Machnikowski's work. She just defended in December. Some of you may have heard her speak in the last couple of years at various events. So in terms of bet hedging, other options include altering the timing of seed sowing. So if your site might have more access to water earlier in the year versus later in the year because of your water rights, that might be an option. Adding more species diversity, I was just mentioning that in terms of hydrologic diversity. But another aspect is phenological diversity. We have found, I was mentioning how the forbs don't necessarily do well in the field. And part of it too is that they grow, when they do grow, they grow quickly and they establish well, but then they might senesce or die off early in the growing season. So to have continuous native plant cover for keeping Phragmites at bay, we need a variety of species. We can also delay germination in part of the seed mix. So we have developed protocols for breaking dormancy in a lot of these species. And that is so that when people are seeding, they know that their seeds are going to germinate right away if the seeds are being put out there at the optimal time. But it turns out it's really hard to predict even 2 or 3 weeks after seeding if the conditions will remain optimal. So a newer strategy that we are recommending in the seed mix and leave the other half of the seed mix just intact. And so those seeds might germinate over the next year or 2 as conditions, again, suitable conditions might emerge. A similar strategy would be to sow seeds over multiple years. And that is much more logistically complicated, but it has shown some promise. And then another strategy is to just seed across multiple sites, not put all your eggs in one basket. So let me just speak really briefly about what Haley found. So she had experiments at both Howard Slough and Farmington Bay. You can see the map down there in the lower left. In the Howard Slough site, she had continuous moisture availability in her research plots. And in this experiment, she looked at adding more species diversity, delaying germination, and sowing seeds over multiple years. In this particular case, at this particular site, she found that her low species diversity mix actually resulted in the highest total native cover because there was continuous moisture availability. She found hardstem bulrush dominating. But then this bed hedging mix had the benefit of having the highest species diversity across all the plots. And so, so both of those might be desirable based on, you know, different management goals, whether it's biomass production or high cover versus species diversity. And interestingly, in this particular site where the conditions were pretty good and consistently good, the delayed germination and the sowing over 2 years didn't have an added benefit, which is good because that's a much more logistically complicated approach. So, okay, so back to the soil moisture shallow flooding theme. Without consistent soil moisture shallow flooding, revegetation will fail. And so we can do all these bed hedging strategies, but at the end of the day, there are going to be many places where it just is not going to work, and we need to plan accordingly. If we know we're going to have a terrible water year, we might be looking at one this year, or if we have multiple sites that have different levels of access to water, it's going to really matter, again, because these seeds and seedlings are so highly vulnerable. And this, coming back to Haley's work again, her other site was at Farmington Bay. When she installed her plots outside the Teal Lake dike at Farmington Bay, there was sufficient moisture and the conditions looked great. But within about 3 weeks of seeding, the conditions became very dry, and then basically was bone dry for most of the rest of the year. Same thing happened again in 2025. Sufficient moisture for a narrow window, and even though she had emergent and meadow and playa species, basically nothing could handle, even those playa drought tolerant species could not handle those conditions. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here with just a couple kind of 30,000 foot perspectives here. So sharing new knowledge and fostering collaboration requires diverse approaches. So Lauren Taylor's research, through her interview, she found that when she asked managers and restoration practitioners how they want to learn about revegetation, peer-to-peer learning was at the top of the list. And we have really tried to integrate some of her findings as well as some of just best practices in general. And some of the strategies we have used are working side by side with managers in large-scale experiments. We'll see some photos on the next slide. We host an annual meeting with managers. DWR used to lead this, and we've kind of taken over facilitating it, where we share our research findings and managers share their restoration activities, and we can kind of really stay up to date. We also have put together expert panels and discussions on revegetation. Here's a couple examples from 2024. We've also done field tours and demonstrations of revegetation. In the lower right there, you can see a demonstration of how to put a sod mat out, and North Fork Native Plants came down and helped with that. They're a native plant company up in Idaho. We also, I know managers don't necessarily prefer to read these extension documents, but I think it is really essential to solidify and formalize what we have found and translate it into language that is understandable for all, so that we can share that knowledge more broadly. So that's been a big part of our efforts. And we have also put together a number of YouTube videos from various events, like that panel of expert day that we had at Farmington Bay. Sustained collaborations and funding also are essential for fostering useful research. Here, our goal is to inform management and restoration. And so we have many, many examples where we have been able to work with various wetland managers for lots of students' experiments. And as a result, we have then better site access, access to large scale machinery, such as for this hydroseeding event here. And we can do much larger scale experiments where our results are then much more relevant to restoration and management. So I think it's really been a win-win situation for all. Sustained funding and collaborations allow for more impactful training of students to support Utah's natural resources. And so this is just to let you know that the grant funding that we have received, not only do we get to do fun and interesting research, but we're also training the next generation of our natural resource managers. And here are, of the graduate students I've had over the last 17 years, here are 9 of them that are working in Northern Utah for various agencies and organizations and having, hopefully a strong local impact. So with that, I would like to thank our partners and funders, and especially Forestry Fire State Lands for the fantastic funding for our experiments. And also a number of other organizations that have supported our research program. And I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time.
Karin, thank you so much.
I don't know if I should stop sharing. I'll do that for a second. Yeah.
Wayne, go ahead.
Yeah, Karin, that was really impressive and nice to see a review of all the work you've done. Thank you very much. One question I have you done experiments to see how resistant the native plants that get established are to reinvasion by Phragmites? Or is this something that has to be done every 10 years or 5 years, or how does that work out? Or
yeah, we have done, I didn't touch on that too much today, but we have done a lot of experiments, both under controlled conditions in the greenhouse and in the field. And really, I'd say the field experiments are most relevant to, I guess it's a couple things. So in the greenhouse, we can get at mechanistically what plants we think ideally will compete best. And so we have good information on that. That has been many of those forb species, particularly a diversity of forb species. But then the reality of taking that to the field is that many of those forbs don't perform as well as we would like under those harsher field conditions. A couple things here. It just underscores how important it is to be introducing a diversity of species. Phragmites, at the end of the day, though, once it gets in there, there's no native species that can compete well against, like once it's well established, there's no hope. So in terms of trying to deal with it over 5 or 10 years or beyond that, there always has to be follow-up management. And that is really what, the stage that the state agencies are at in terms of their Phragmites management. They're no longer having generally to go and spray tens of thousands of acres, right? They're going out and doing very targeted spraying of newly emerging Phragmites patches and working really in a focused manner on revegetation to try to minimize that reinvasion.
Thank you.
Other questions, either online or in the room? I had a question, Karin. You had talked about just the low number of different species that are available commercially. Do you see that changing, or do you think the constraints of the gathering, the cleaning, all of those logistical components mean that for greater diversity, we're going to have to do it in-house, do it ourselves, have some specialty doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple things at play. From a vendor standpoint, so we also, in our vendor surveys, we ask them what are their biggest challenges, and it's really all about market volatility. And so as revegetation is scaling up and people are it's happening much more broadly and much more consistently, there is going to be that market for these native seed vendors. And so if we can, I think we're kind of at the point where it's going to become more profitable for native vendors to actually be offering a wider array of species. At the same time, too, there are folks locally that have that are starting to step in. So one example is Shane Sterner, who we have worked with, and I know Keith Hambrecht has worked with quite a bit. He is out there collecting species, and he collects what people want, right? And so if you say, I just want saltgrass, he will get gobs and gobs of saltgrass. And that's where most of the market has been. It's been saltgrass and alkali bulrush. But now that Keith is starting to ask, and other managers are asking for a wider array of species, he knows where these species are because he knows the wetlands really well. And he has already developed, he's got the tools in his toolbox to develop and clean those species, or sorry, to collect and clean those species. So I think we're actually in a good position if people start asking and people are investing in revegetating with a much wider array of species. I'm very hopeful, actually.
That's great to hear. Anything else from anyone? Karin, will you put your email in the chat just in case anyone wants to reach out to you afterwards? With any follow-up? Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's not very many people who can see the effect of their career's work from space, but I think Karin is one of those people. You look at satellite images and Great Salt Lake looks vastly different than it did 20 years ago. So that's really exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, you can see Chad Cranny's plots on Google Earth from 20 years, 15 years ago. So go check it out.
Dave. We're going to wrap up our meeting with any updates from anyone in the room. If Linda Freitas were here, I know she'd remind everyone of the Great Salt Lake Issues Forum. That's May 6th through 8th. And I think, I'm not sure if you can sign up now or if you'll be able to sign up soon, but I know they're pulling together the website. But any other things that anyone wants to bring to the group's attention? Okay, our next meeting is going to be May 12th, 9 a.m. in this same room. So if you got lost on your way here, now you know where it is. And same time, starting at 9. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Thank you, especially to our presenters today. We'll see you next time.